Most of us want to feel our working lives are spent doing something worthwhile. Serving a customer, providing for our families, and if we're lucky, making friends and enjoying things along the way. But if you've ever been hooked by the idea of making a difference to the world on a much bigger scale, you're sure to have come across the idea of social entrepreneurship. Taking the skills of innovation and applying them to really difficult social or environmental problems. Intractable problems. In this episode, we'll be hearing from one of the people credited with defining and popularising social entrepreneurship. His name is Bill Drayton, founder of Ashoka, the organisation he launched in 1980 to create and support a global network of these social entrepreneurs. Our conversation took place with me sitting in a quiet suburb of Oxford, the city where Bill went to university, and him sitting in the Ashoka global headquarters, just across the river from the White House, where he once worked. It's a conversation that went in unexpected directions. I wanted to learn about Drayton's life and career, and to hear about Ashoka. He, on the other hand, wanted me to understand the potential and urgent need to transform human society, and the tools of the trade if you're setting out to lead a revolution. He also wanted to recruit me to the cause, and all of us, under the banner of everyone a changemaker. So what started off as a humble podcast interview would perhaps better be titled How to Change the World.
You're listening to The Innovator's Journey, a podcast about the lives and careers of creative people, technology, and the future of work, with your host, Jonathan Winter.
After we introduced ourselves,
Jonathan, hello. What fun.
I asked Bill Drayton to summarise what he does and why it matters. And this is where the fun really starts. So buckle up for the ride. Here's Bill Drayton.
I am a social entrepreneur and have the privilege of being part of the most important culminating revolution of all the revolutions that have been building for centuries. One that leads to everyone being a change maker, i.e. able to give. And when everyone has this ability to give and drive to give, well, what is the greatest gift? It's helping other people give. And you have a very different society where there's no way that the problems outrun the solutions, and where not just the elites, but everyone gets to do love and respect in action at significant levels. This is a much better world, and our job is to help that happen. And it's incredibly exciting and fun.
Seconds into the interview, and my head was already spinning with this positive vision for humanity. But first I wanted to ask about Drayton's personal story, his innovator's journey. Most people begin with their school days or maybe early childhood or even place of birth. Drayton, however, went back a bit further.
We've learned that each of us are children of our parents and grandparents and cultures. And that's certainly true for me.
In fact, he went back 200 years to two famous sisters who campaigned for women's rights and against slavery.
The Grimke sisters from South Carolina were told that they couldn't be lawyers because they were women. And so they said, we are going to give testimony against slavery, which they did. And that created a problem because they wanted to talk to church congregations, and women were not supposed to talk to congregations with men in them. So this created a problem. And then another relative from Philadelphia went to jail having to do with the Underground Railroad. So it's a very strong element in the family.
Winding forward to the 1930s, Drayton also admires the pioneering spirit of his parents.
Well, they both did something completely unreasonable at 19.
His mother moved from Australia to New York, armed only with a cello.
Yes, so she arrived in America in the middle of the Depression, and she played the cello and knew nobody. Now, this is not very safe, an easy thing to do. You know, women were not allowed to do a whole lot of things. You could be a teacher or nurse, and maybe you could do music. And so she did music, and she said she was going from the outer edges of the world, Australia, to the center, where she correctly said it was New York City. And she was going to go to the center of society in New York. Very strong set of objectives.
Meanwhile, his American father, at 19, became an explorer.
This was a time when dealing with wilderness and being rather masculine was very much, Teddy Roosevelt, that whole thing. Well, he was part of that, and so he just decided, so much for college, he was going off to the Sahara to do some exploring, which he did. He was in considerable risk, but he pursued, and because he was a listener, and he was, 19-year-old, he made his way to a Tuareg community in the mountains, and his age mates helped him find some caves with painting, and so the thing was a success, much to the distress of his parents, and he did many other exploring things. So my parents had an inner confidence.
Born in 1943, Bill Drayton traces his passion for change-making to those deep family roots in the Quakers of Delaware Valley, the fiercely independent Puritans of New England, and 6 generations of family in Australia who were interested in ideas and community. He captured the resulting unspoken family philosophy in a single sentence.
Do whatever you want to do, but just be the best in the world at it.
Thus, equipped with an independent mind, Bill's entrepreneurial journey began at elementary school by skipping class.
That Yankee independence, I didn't understand why I was being tortured with Latin and French and mathematics, and so I didn't really do those things. I loved history and geography that explained how the world worked. So I started things. It started very early with a hand-typed newspaper with carbon paper.
That struck a chord with me. My earliest entrepreneurial exploits were also carbon copied. I think by this point we were getting along well.
We are part of a generation, maybe the last people that have ever heard of carbon paper.
Have we lost you at this point? Sorry about that. But while I, as a small boy, might have matched my guest sheet for sheet in carbon paper, at the same age, young Bill Drayton was already networking with the cultural and philanthropic elite in New York to get his geography homework done. In this case, by visiting writer and explorer Edward LaRocque Tinker.
Everyone in our class drew straws for a Latin American country, so I drew Uruguay. Well, in New York, you can find, and I did, lead toy soldiers from Uruguay. And Edward LaRocque Tinker, I went to his place, and he very kindly loaned me a silver mate bowl and straw.
In case you haven't picked it up, Drayton loves Manhattan. I think the way he experienced it as a child shaped his view of what children need to succeed, and what everyone needs to be a changemaker.
Growing up in Manhattan is such a privilege. Once you're allowed to cross the street, you have a free bus and subway pass. You can go anywhere. There's no station wagon prison.
He contrasts that freedom to roam with life today in the Western world. Here in the UK, for example, in 1971, 9 in every 10 primary school children were allowed to travel home from school alone. By 2010, the figure was 1 in 4.
This is a catastrophe. David McClelland, The Achieving Society, the rise and fall of civilizations correlates with the rise and fall of need for achievement in the population. With a one-generation time lag, he's demonstrated this with the expansion and contraction of Greek commerce, the Incan and other Andean empires. It's a very clear correlation.
With his need for achievement and willingness to roam fully charged, at some point it was inevitable that Drayton would fly the nest, where the nest, in this case, was New York. He was fascinated by the great cultures of Asia, especially South Asia.
How could you not be interested? It's so central. And India is like New York. It's very diverse. And it's comfortable with diversity.
Drayton set out for India as soon as he and his friends could lay their hands on suitable transport.
I got 3 high school friends, and we purchased a Volkswagen microbus in Munich and drove to India because it was the only way we could afford to get there. And I'd been dreaming to get to India since the 4th or 5th grade, if not before that.
Back in New York, Drayton had met Bayard Rustin, a leader in the civil rights movement and advisor to Martin Luther King. And it was Bayard Rustin who introduced Drayton and his friends to some of the key figures of the Gandhian movement in India.
So he introduced us to Jayaprakash Narayan, who was one of Gandhi and Nehru's closest colleagues, and Vinoba Bhave, who led the social part of the Gandhian movement, whereas Nehru and company took the part that went into government. And I was able to spend days walking with Vinoba. So those were very direct Gandhian exposures, and they, of course, influenced Ashoka. Really, the concept of Ashoka came during that trip.
But back to Bayard Rustin for a moment.
Bayard was an African-American gay Quaker from Pennsylvania, and he went to India to study the Gandhian movement, and he came back, and at that point, being gay was illegal. That put limits on what he could do that was very visible. And he and King got together, and they created the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Bayard is the one who actually wrote the original papers. They worked together very closely. And we had 400 years of failure in dealing with slavery. And the Gandhian methodology and the historical moment, but the Gandhian methodology was key, and so was he.
This Gandhian influence turns out to be central to Bill Drayton's thinking on how to change the world. I asked him to sum it up.
The rate of change is so fast now that this is the first generation that cannot be successful, cannot be good people by diligently following the rules. They aren't there. And the degree of interconnection and the complexity of context is just increasing so fast. Well, Gandhi understood that. And he knew that people, to be able to function, have to develop conscious empathy-based living for the good of all. So the truth force, satyagraha. And that means they cannot have anger and hatred. And that requires discipline. It's just an incredibly powerful insight, and it brought down the empires, and one after another, it's been tearing down all these prejudices and terrible behaviors. And that's why I think he was by far the greatest person of that century. He understood it, he lived it, which is very difficult. And Gandhi figured out how to make it the vehicle of political and social and personal change. It's amazing.
Drayton returned to America and started at Harvard with this discovery inside him. There he created the Ashoka table, bringing prominent government, union and church leaders together for off-the-record conversations at which students could ask how things really worked. After that came Oxford, then Yale Law School, where he organised with fellow students to support government proceedings throughout the Northeast. It was serious work, but it had its lighter moments.
Our conditions were it was free, and we would guarantee thorough law journal quality control, but we had to have full access to executive sessions of the committees. At one point, the Connecticut legislature was debating a tax, and our students were hiding under a table because they're the only ones who could explain it fully, and they weren't supposed to be on the floor. It was fascinating because the students started off being afraid of these legislators, largely because they came from different classes. There are a few exceptions. Hillary Rodham, later Clinton, was not afraid from her first term. And she was very, very smart, very good at dealing with people. wonderful sense of humor.
From Yale, he became a consultant at strategy firm McKinsey and Company. You may wonder why someone with a drive for social reform entered the halls of big capitalism. Well, as well as viewing it as a great training ground, he rapidly and rather dangerously spotted a Drayton-shaped niche, designing new taxes for New York City. You know, things like gasoline taxes and nicotine taxes.
I designed a tar and nicotine tax, so the tax went up with the level of tar and nicotine. And it caused 1 out of 8 cigarette smokers in New York City to shift brands within 6 months. It just drove the cigarette industry crazy.
This got him into fairly deep water after just 3 months being a management consultant. But I think he started to relish the role of the underdog facing up to powerful corporate interests in the tobacco industry.
I was, as usual, the smallest and youngest person in the room, but I could tell that they were lying.
Taking a stand against the tobacco giants did him no harm, and, somewhat to his surprise as a junior, he was backed by one of the firm's founding figures, Marvin Bower, a man he regarded as having real ethical fibre.
It is absolutely essential to have ethical fiber for any person, any group, any organization, not limited to business. If there's any slippage there, it's a cancer that goes riot.
McKinsey is a firm known for its up or out career policy, although in Drayton's case, I think you might say it was up and out. It was a move to the White House.
Jimmy Carter asked me to help him in a small group plan how he would have a great presidency if he won. And from there, I ended up in the White House while we were pushing through airline deregulation and some other things that were not terribly popular with the constituencies involved, but were important.
From the White House, Drayton moved to a key role at the Environmental Protection Agency, where he launched emissions trading, a system that had significant positive impact on the environment and was a forerunner of carbon markets today.
And in Jimmy Carter, we had a president who really cared about the environment. He read things. He thought about things. He, honest to God, believed that the best politics was doing the right thing. So that's who he was and still is. I mean, he's just a remarkable person. And it was in that context that we introduced some 40 different reforms in the process, of which emissions trading was one.
By this stage in the interview, I was beginning to see how Bill Drayton's idea of social entrepreneurship was being shaped to encompass system-wide change in which regulation is one of the necessary tools. I was also seeing more clearly the talents that have given him such an exceptional career. Yet this idea of talent is a strange one. All of the guests on this podcast have enormous talent, yet many of them ascribe their success more to hard work and curiosity than to some inborn characteristics. I think that's empowering for all of us, the idea that our success isn't predetermined by our genes. For a podcast interviewer, however, the peculiar humility that goes with this can be a bit frustrating. I asked Bill about his good memory.
I don't know where you got that idea.
He had told me that he still recalls the pages of his geography textbooks at school. Does he have a special memory?
Well, I think all of us do. If we really care about something, we remember it. That's the way the brain works.
We don't all have a photographic memory, do we?
When I'm backpacking and I go to an area that I haven't been in for decades, I am very likely to be able to say, behind that hill, there is an old abandoned mine. Because I really, really care about this. And, you've got to figure this out when you're backpacking. And I like to backpack off trail as much as possible. So it's, so whatever you really care about, you remember. And the other thing I think is important is you don't remember things if you don't listen. And listening is a completely critical ability. If you're trying to figure out how to change society, you have to understand all the different pieces and see the pattern. And I think any entrepreneur pays intense attention about what they care about, and they're listening every day. They want to hear a squeak. Uh-oh, now we've got to figure out the next creative move.
I loved that link between the intellectual capabilities of an entrepreneur and really caring about things. But try as I might, and I tried, I couldn't get Bill to talk about himself as exceptional. I pointed out his many accolades and awards, and he pointed me to the greatness of the cause and how compelling it is, and that it's not surprising it has gained attention. Every second of our conversation was focused on his purpose, except he also took time to listen to my story too. And so, wrapping up this first part of the podcast about his personal and professional story, and before we talked about Ashoka and the future, I asked Bill to think of a creative artefact that might in some way reflect his journey as an innovator.
This September, I was backpacking in the high tundra areas of the Beartooth Mountains, which is on the Wyoming-Montana border. And so I have several images, and I think they speak for themselves, so I will send them to you.
I'm looking at his photographs of sunlight on a stream, a lake, and the moon rising over distant forests and hills. I wondered what these images represent for him as a creative, entrepreneurial person.
Well, every day we sleep. What's going on then is that the brain, I think, is trying to make sense and order all this flood of input. And it decides, as we said earlier, what to remember and to see patterns. So, small thing, when I interview someone, I try not to talk about it with people that day, because I know the next morning I'm going to wake up and I'll have seen much more of the pattern. Now, I think the 3 weeks of backpacking, you step out of the tight synchromesh of human society, and you're in an environment that is very engaging because it's challenging, it's beautiful, there are puzzles every time you turn around. For example, in terms of time, you can look at a body of water and see minute life, and in a month it's going to be a solid block of ice. But now you can also look at that same water and you'll see the layering of sedimentary rock. And oh, that's from an ocean 350 million years ago. And then at night, that lake, by 10:30, 11 o'clock, the hot and cold air stabilizes and it becomes a mirror. And at 12,000 feet, the air is thin. And you can see individual stars moving across the lake. Now, from that little bit of life to seeing the universe, that's your day. And it's very different than being controlled by your watch. Something very important happens without planning. It allows you to see patterns on a bigger scale than you can at night.
We'll be back shortly with more from my conversation with Bill Drayton about Ashoka today, its vision and its method for changing the world.
You're listening to The Innovator's Journey, a podcast about the lives and careers of creative people, technology, and the future of work, with your host, Jonathan Winter.
If the subject of this podcast is how to change the world, then the innovation, in this case, is going to be the idea of social entrepreneurship, and the organisation Ashoka, which was founded by my guest Bill Drayton in 1980 and is known for identifying and supporting the world's leading social entrepreneurs. Today there are several thousand Ashoka Fellows around the world, each pursuing an idea to solve a pressing social concern.
Any idea anywhere in the world.
Ashoka's first focus has been to help these innovators to succeed, sometimes by bringing them together forming a team of teams and using a deliberate method for large-scale change. Then, every 3 years, they measure the results and the impact. Drawing on this work with social entrepreneurs, Ashoka's wider vision today is to see a new generation in which everyone is a changemaker, using what Drayton calls conscious empathy to make a more generous world with better outcomes for everyone.
It's a fundamental transformation. It's now well underway, and our job is to help that along.
Helping that along starts with those innovators for the common good, the social entrepreneurs.
Let's start with the fellows. Who are they? They have a big idea, new idea, that will change the pattern in their field, at least at a continental level. And they are totally first-class entrepreneurs, but they're social entrepreneurs. So they are committed from deep within to the good of all. And it's that combination of a big fundamental pattern change idea in the hands of a great leading social entrepreneur that makes history. And we're very good at finding them and helping them get started. And the most important help in getting started is they become part of a community of their peers.
Ashoka's support for that community of peers includes a sophisticated set of ideas about how to change the world. Open sourcing a problem and a purpose whose time is right, seeing patterns in how to solve that problem, then defining what Drayton calls a self-correcting decision-making architecture. It all sounds quite conceptual, but makes sense as a set of tools and ideas for creating real change in what Drayton describes as an everything-changing, everything-connected world. And once the problem and the framework for a potential solution have been identified, then the entrepreneurial jiu jitsu begins.
We're a small force. We have 4,000 fellows, and we can't get the world to change by ourselves. So small force builds big force to get the world to change. And the first step is to get what we call jiu-jitsu partners.
Jiu-jitsu is a Japanese martial art, and the word means the yielding technique, which involves using your opponent's force against them rather than confronting them with your own force. Quite a clever metaphor, I think, for how to bring about change. I asked for a real-life example, and he talked about the goal to reach young people in Brazil and equip them to be changemakers.
Okay, well now, what are the most important forces that we need to have mobilized? We think it's teachers' unions, a few ed schools that will change the dynamic for all ed schools, general publishers, specialist publishers, and a city or province.
Drayton gave me an example of how this might work in practice.
For a country like Brazil, we get a dozen jiu-jitsu partners, and then we have to go into those organizations and find 5, a team of what we call next generation leaders. That's 12 times 5. That's 60 people. We can do that. And you have a meeting of 3 ed schools, a radio network of 500 stations, 7 Ashoka Young Changemakers fellows, the leading education publisher, and others. The meeting says, you 3 ed schools, send letters to all your alumni. That's 95% of the teachers in the Amazon. And you can tell them that the union is for it, not against it. And the radio networks want these stories, and the Ashoka Young Changemakers will help you in the schools with the kids and with the radio stations. That is the second level of our organizational model, a team of teams. And over 35% of the Brazilian fellows are involved in this because this is really exciting. And it's expanding and multiplying their work and their ideas, and they are very powerful.
This collective effort by the Ashoka community in Brazil and around the world is largely focused on young people and what Drayton calls the new literacy of being a changemaker. when young people experience that, he says, it's transformative.
They get on the bicycle, they have the experience of having a dream, building a team, changing their world. Once they've done that, they know that they're a change maker. They know they have the power that they need. Please give me a problem. It's life-changing, and it happens when you're 13 or 15. You don't have to wait for a PhD. So I'm describing the new literacy to you. And we have 1,400 fellows focused on kids. 87% of them put kids in charge in hundreds and hundreds of different ways. And math scores go up, language scores go up, bullying rates go down. But what we care about most is that every kid that does this has the power to have a good life. And they're going to help everyone around them have that power. So this is profoundly important.
The Innovator's Journey podcast usually includes predictions about the future of work. So I asked my usual question about the impact of technology on work and the fear of AI taking jobs.
Look, replacing repetitive stuff, for heaven's sakes, who wants to do that? Yes.
Fair enough.
Then we can focus on helping one another be ever richer, wiser people, individually and collectively.
Back to the mission. And although by now my mind was full of models and theories of change, at its heart, the transformation he's talking about, although not easy, is, as they say, not rocket science.
When you help your 6-year-old who's just hit her brother, who's 4, and you put your arm around her and say, well, you must have been pretty upset when you did that. That is helping her practice conscious, empathy-based living for the good. And then you ask, well, how do you think your brother felt? And why do you think he reacted the way he did? What do you think we can do now? Anybody can do that. This is not astrophysics. And when you do that, you're becoming a change maker every bit as much as your daughter.
It was time to conclude with my usual request to sum it up in the form of advice to his younger self and then to the world. So what would he say if he wrote to the young Bill Drayton, and by implication to any aspiring social entrepreneur?
First of all, a negative. When people tell you you can't or shouldn't do something, be very polite, because what it usually means is they didn't do it, and you're going to make them feel nervous and not so good about themselves if you do it. So it's important to be polite, but don't listen. The other side is the flip side of that. When you look at the world's great social entrepreneurs, it's not astrophysics. They just gave themselves permission to see an opportunity or a problem, and then they were a bit persistent in thinking about solutions. Seriously, read, get to know these stories, and you'll see.
And his message to the world?
We're only given these historical transitions rarely. We are living at a moment of transition where every single person has the opportunity to make a contribution by helping your friends, your family, whatever organization you care about, see, oh, this is a new world. I see the new world. And then help them through that transition.
And with that call to action, and with a smile and a sense of connection and friendship, and of having somehow been recruited to a cause, our conversation was complete. Thank you, Bill Drayton.
Well, Jonathan, thank you. You're part of building this new world. That's what this podcast is doing. So thank you.
Thank you for listening to The Innovator's Journey with me, Jonathan Winter. If you enjoyed today's story, do share it with your friends and colleagues and subscribe to make sure you hear future episodes. This podcast was recorded in Riverside, edited and transcribed automatically in Descript, with algorithmic music from SoundDraw and artwork generated with DAL-E. The rest was human.